Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Business Planning for a New World webinar. We've just gone 10 o'clock, so we've turned this on. We've still got a few people coming into the room at this point, though. So we might wait for a couple of minutes to kick off properly. I'll just keep an eye on the number of participants who actually joined, but we'll get started very soon. I might start with some of the housekeeping stuff just in between now and then anyway. So firstly, I just wanted to say a big thanks to the team at Screen New South Wales for putting this program together and for providing such great support for the screen industry in New South Wales. They're doing a tremendous job in these difficult times, so really appreciate all of their efforts in doing what they're doing. I also wanted to take this opportunity to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And before we do start, we'll have Amelia from Screen New South Wales who will join us for a quick update. So I'll just bring her up on screen.
Hi everyone. Morning. My name is Amelia Carew-Reid and I'm one of the Screen Industry Development Managers at Screen New South Wales. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I'd also like to acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have joined us today. This is the fourth in a series of webinars from the Screen Connect series, and we're so pleased to be working again with Ian Murray, CEO of 113 Partners, to present today's session. Ian has over 20 years experience either running creative businesses or as a strategic advisor to Australia's most cutting-edge creative businesses, so he has a wealth of knowledge and insights and on-the-ground experience that he's going to share with you today. Next week, we're presenting a film festival forum where we're going to bring together representatives from the New South Wales Film Festival community to discuss how they're navigating their way through current challenges to deliver their film festivals. You'll hear from City Film Festival CEO Lee Small, Camille Latouf, who's the director of the Lebanese Film Festival, Janine Collins, principal of J9 Consulting, and the discussion will be moderated by Gary Paramanathan, the founder of Colourfest. So yeah, we're busy. We're busily putting together more webinars, panels and digital events with other fantastic speakers and guests, which we'll be announcing over the coming weeks. If you want to stay informed about these events, you can sign up to our e-newsletter via the Screen New South Wales website, also our social media channels, and you can also follow our Crowdcast channel so that once new events are open for registration, you'll be notified automatically. Another initiative that we're running at Screen New South Wales are weekly one-on-one meetings with the Screen investment managers. So Screen content producers, screenwriters, filmmakers can book a conference, a video conference meeting with investment managers to help them build their relationships with the investment managers, to get first-hand advice about projects in development, and discuss pathways to finance and markets. These are taking place every Thursday on a rotating basis, and there's an email address to book in through. All of those links will be in the chat box for you, and of course get in touch with us if you have any questions. That's it from me. Thanks everyone. Enjoy today's webinar. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you so much. Okay, what I'll be doing today is mostly having the slideshow up, and so you'll have that to be able to really focus on as we're talking. So you'll have me there just in the corner of your screen, but really that's it's the slideshow which and the slides there which we'll be focusing in on. A little bit of housekeeping before we start, which is what we have up there at the moment. Sam Guthlieben, who's one of the partners of 113 Partners, will be in the chat window today. We have a few links here and there, I think, which may be there to worth posting up there, but probably not as many as we had last time we were doing this. I won't be paying a huge amount of attention to that part of the screen because I'll actually have the PowerPoint up, so she'll be moderating any chat that goes on there, and And if there's any questions which need to be asked, we'll talk that through in a second. But she can also post those over to the Q&A section if possible. Please do feel free to use that chat function though throughout the session. In fact, it would be great just to test that is working for everybody. So I can see quite a few people are in there saying good morning and so on, which is great. But you know, if you'd like to jump in there and tell me what your go-to special dinner is that you cook at home when you want to impress guests, please post those sorts of things in there at the moment, so I can see that everybody's hearing this and that you can hear me and that it's all working. Nobody's got any great dinners, which they're... Oh, there we go. Matthew's got a pear and leek tart. Well, that sounds pretty... Oh, mussels. Excellent, eh? Yes. So, okay, I might have to hit you up for some of those recipes later on as we move through this. Richard Harris will be joining us at certain points as well when we're doing some Q&A sessions. We'll be doing that twice throughout this process. So we'll have a break about midway through so we can stop and answer any questions you've got and hear Richard's thoughts on some of these things as well. And we'll do another session on the Q&A at the very end of this. The presentation is being live captioned. So if anybody who does need those live captions, the link has been provided in the chat channel there at the very beginning, but you'll be able to access those if you need them. From a technology perspective, it's worth mentioning that Crowdcast does work with lots of browsers, so you're probably using a whole range of different browsers, but if you are experiencing any problems, it does play nicest with Chrome. So if it's giving you some sort of grief, then I would probably suggest your first port of troubleshooting would be to try accessing this using the Chrome web browser. As I said, we will be running two Q&A sessions throughout at 2 points throughout the session. So if you have got any of those questions which are popping up that you'd like to have answered or addressed, there is at the very bottom of the screen there a button that says ask a question. So it would be great if you could ask the question in there. If you do want to just post in the chat as well, though, then Sam will grab those and be able to put those into the ask a question section for you as well. So either way, but yeah, there is an ask a question button at the very bottom of your screen there, which you can ask questions in directly. And when we stop to take those breaks, we'll be addressing anything which is in there. Today we will be keeping things very simple. It will just be the PowerPoint and myself up on screen for pretty much most of what we're talking about. And I believe the session is being recorded. So if you do drop out, or if you have to go, or if you want to watch back certain sections of this later to revisit a particular topic, you'll be able to access that video to do so after we've finished up today. I will try and take breaks at certain logical points. We certainly have those two around the Q&A sessions. If there is a natural break point, you know, outside of that, that we need to take a break to sort of stop and stretch or use the toilet or have a top up on your tea or give your brain a rest, we'll try to do that as well. So we're going to be breaking today's session into two halves. The first half of the session will be about really short-term action-based business planning. And during that part of the session, we'll be talking about, starting by talking about the benefits of planning, why we do it, some of the tools that we can use when we're considering the changing environment we're operating in, and how we can best adapt to the changes that we are experiencing based on our individual capabilities and skills. And then after we've gone through some Q&As after that first half, then we'll pause and have a look at we'll then pause and take a look at some of the questions you might have. And then the second half of the session, we'll be looking at more formal business planning, some of the frameworks and models that you can use to address some of the elements of your planning that may not necessarily come as naturally to you as the first sections. There'll be things like financial metric testing, developing marketing communications plans, slate evaluations, and tools like that. So, or tools you might want to use to manage your sales activities and sales pipeline. But let's kick off with a review of why we actually do business planning in the first place. So why do we plan? So depending on where you're at in your business cycle, you're probably going to be engaged in some sort of planning for a different reason. So the form that those plans tends to take and the level of detail that you go into when you're doing those sorts of plans is also going to change. The most common reasons that we encounter when people are engaging in business planning activities are firstly that you're starting out. You're setting up a business for the first time. You want to make sure that you've properly considered all the elements that you need to in order to give yourself the best chance of success. Chances are with this sort of planning, it's something which you're doing for yourself. If you haven't been running a business before, it's unlikely that you're going to be preparing these sorts of plans for external investors to be asking for funds to help you get started. So with this sort of plan, it's most likely that you're going to be using a fairly rough set of goals and ambitions for your business, and they're going to focus very heavily on the short to medium term. And they'll be a bit fuzzy after that because you haven't necessarily run a business of the nature of whatever it is you're starting up before. And that's fine. In fact, that's good. You're recognizing that you don't necessarily know what you don't know yet, and you're focusing on those things that you can see, and you're playing what's in front of you, which is really important. So that's not a bad thing when you're first starting out a business for the first time and doing those sorts of planning activities. Oftentimes, those sorts of plans are a hybrid between a top-line plan and what we call an action plan. So a top-line business plan is generally comprised of a set of goals that you've set that are determined by whatever success looks like for you, which will be a very individual set of criteria. It may be about getting a particular project up, or about getting a particular credit or some sort of certification. It may be about hitting some sort of financial target, or it might be about achieving some sort of level of reputation or brand recognition, or it might be about building a minimum viable product if you're creating an actual product, or demonstrating a market interest in a business model. So the top line plans are very much about just setting those as sort of very top line goals as to what you want to achieve with the business. It's not necessarily going into the details of how you're going to do that. And that comes into play when you start looking at your action plan. So an action plan, on the other hand, is very much around having a list of the activities that you're going to undertake in the short term to drive you towards those top line goals. They tend to be very short term, sort of from things you can do immediately from today to about 3 months, 12 weeks in advance. Again, they seem to lose cohesion if you go far beyond 12 weeks. They really need to be things which you can sort of see, which are right in front of you, which are activities that you can do right now. So action plan actions tend to be easily defined. They're able to be delegated, and you know when you finish the task. So as a general rule, you can sort of have 3 columns in an action plan worksheet. One will be what is the actual action that we're undertaking. The second one will be who's going to be responsible for making sure that thing happens. And the third one is what's the time frame that we're expecting that to be completed by. So while they're informed by the bigger picture plan that you've done, they're the bite-sized chunks that you need to take if you're trying to eat that elephant. So you've probably heard that phrase that anybody can eat an elephant. You just have to do it one bite at a time. So an action plan is trying to break that elephant down into bite-sized chunks so that you can actually eat, take those steps to finally get through eating the whole thing. The second reason that we see people writing business plans is that they're leaving a business. So if you want to sell, or you want to step away from a business that you've built, you might want to have your staff or your kids take it over. You might want to shut it down. There's a whole range of different things that you could be considering when you're looking at actually exiting a business or leaving a business. So this type of business planning is really around exit or succession planning. It's about how you're either going to realize and ideally maximize the value that you've built in your business over a period of time, or it may be that you're looking to sell your business to a competitor or somebody else in your supply chain, or merging with a frenemy, a friendly enemy or a competitor. Or it may be that you're looking for an easy way to transition out of your business by handing the reins over to the next generation. Or it may simply be that you want to manage the shutdown of your business so you can preserve as much of your retained profits and benefits that you can. So there's a whole range of reasons that you might be looking at and methodologies you might look at planning around for when you're looking to shut a business down or leave a business. Depending on what the rationale for that type of planning is, then you'll develop different types of plans. So if it's about succession planning, for instance, you're dealing with the people who already know your business, so you can really focus in on how that transition is going to occur. Whereas a sale or merger, then you'll need to be justifying to a potential acquirer why your business is worth what the value it is that you're asking for. So how formal or how informal the planning is for leaving, for the type of planning you're doing when you're exiting a business, is really going to be determined by those parameters. An example of this is a client that we worked with down in Wollongong some years back who ran an advertising agency, and he was very keen to exit the business and had gone through the process of doing some very formal planning because he was looking to sell the business originally, and couldn't find anybody in the local area who wanted to buy the business at the value that he wanted to sell it at. And so then we moved from there into looking at succession planning and whether or not there was a way for his staff to consider taking that business on and running it themselves. Now, he had very capable staff, and they'd been with him for a long time, so it made a lot of sense for him to do that. The way in which what he recognized from that process was that he needed to step away from the business more and more. And so the big part of our planning with him was allowing him to do that. In the end, the easiest way that he found to do that was he really liked playing golf. And so the first year that he was looking to work on his succession plan, he decided to play golf 1 day a week. I think it was a Monday. And then the second year, he decided to play it on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then the third year on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And by the time we got to the 5th year, he'd successfully transitioned out of the business and had handed over the business to his staff, who were by that point running it quite comfortably and capably without him. So in that case, it was a very informal sort of way of being able to plan that out. We had the end goal in mind, and then we had a really simple set of actions that he could take to be able to get there in a way which worked for everybody. But he could then slowly and carefully manage that transition over time. The third reason that we often see for doing business planning is, and this is the one that we're generally asked to assist with frequently, it's about growing your business. So if you've had a successful business for a period of time and it's doing okay, or well even, but you may be finding that you're hitting some sort of soft ceiling. So you're not sure how to, or whether indeed whether you should be increasing your size and capacity. You might want to explore how you might go about growing and whether you can do that with your own resources or whether you're going to need capital from elsewhere. So this sort of planning can take place in a few different forms as well. It almost always starts out with a broad exploration of the various ways in which you can grow your business. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on in the session. But then we arrive, once we've agreed on one of those key strategies, we've arrived on one or more specific sets of strategies that we want to engage in. Oftentimes, we'll set some very specific goals and targets around how we're going to achieve those strategies. So they'll be financial targets, they may be resource targets, they may be some other sort of measurable goals, so we can really closely monitor the metrics of how we're progressing towards those sorts of implementation of those strategies. Because you've been running a successful business for a period of time, then your planning activities tend to be less focused on your business's usual activities and more focused on those incremental activities that you want to engage in and grow. So it's not a business plan for the whole business, it's really a plan of just those incremental activities which are going to drive the growth that you're interested in exploring. Sometimes, next type of planning, sometimes we want to explore how we're going to shrink a business. So over the last few months, unfortunately, this is the type of planning we've been working on with quite a few of our clients. What we've been really looking at is how we can decrease expenditure, maximize the utility from the resource base we've got to maintain profits, and do our best to weather the tough times that people are going through right now. So this type of planning tends to be very heavily finance based. So it's very much looking at the finance metrics of the business and figuring out how we can ensure that there's real longevity to the business as it's going through a downturn. Perhaps the most common reason we see people in the creative industries anyway engaging in business planning activities is because they have to go and apply for some sort of grant or loan. So it's often the trigger point or the catalyst which makes them actually engage in business planning. So in these instances, you're trying to describe to somebody who's external from the business and who isn't intimately familiar with what it is that you do and how you operate, why your business is going to be a success, how some form of injection of capital is going to significantly increase your success or accelerate you towards the goals that you set for yourself. And these types of plans tend to be quite formal in nature. So they tend to have to go back and explain the history of your business and of yourself and your key staff. So all of those key resources you've got, they need to be able to convince somebody external from you that what you're saying is legitimate and believable and the goals and the KPIs that you're setting are achievable and appropriate to hitting the overall macro goals that you're setting for the business. Because the audience for these sorts of plans is somebody who's external from your business, these types of plans tend to have to go into a lot more detail about your environment and where you sit within it, because that's not something which the person who's reading it inherently understands. So interestingly, while you would think that this type of planning is often, could be just boring and the least useful type of business planning, we do find that it often ends up being particularly beneficial and useful for business owners, just because it forces you to think about your business from an outside perspective, and perhaps to explore different ways of doing business that you might not have ordinarily considered for yourself, or to consider the questions that an external person may ask of you about your business, which may be things which you kind of had in your subconscious, but you'd never necessarily actually articulated until you actually went through that formal business planning process. And the last reason that we engage in business planning is that you might want to explore something new. So if there's a significant change in the operating environment, or if you recognise that there's likely to be some external factors that are going to have an impact on how you go about doing whatever it is that you do, then this sort of planning is particularly useful. So in this type of environment that we're in right now, it's incredibly useful, because you might sort of be asking yourself, why would I even bother doing a business plan when there's so much uncertainty out there in the marketplace? This sort of business planning really allows you to think about how you might pivot your business into some sort of new area. It's also not uncommon for new businesses who've been operating for long enough to have tested those initial assumptions. So going right back to that first cohort of why people plan, if you're starting a business and you've set those sort of initial fuzzy goals for it, after you've been running the business for a while, you might recognise that those goals that you set weren't necessarily grounded completely in reality, or that the world's slightly different from the way that you thought that it was. And so this sort of planning often, it isn't dissimilar to planning for a new business, in that it's very action-based. So it's almost always done for yourself rather than for an external person. It's done for you and your internal team, and it needs to be flexible to adapt to ongoing changes, because you're recognizing that there's some sort of change going on in the environment, or some sort of need for change within your business, which requires it to pivot. The one common theme across all these forms of business planning is it's about setting goals. So we will talk about setting goals in just a moment, but I think the key takeaway from this particular point that we're talking about here is that business plans don't always need to be very formal, structured documents. They can be, they can take all sorts of different shapes and forms, and all of those are appropriate for the type of planning that you're doing. So you don't feel that just because you're doing some very top-line planning, or just doing some rough planning on the back of a magazine, that it's not right for your business. You're probably doing the right type of planning for whatever it is that you need to be doing right now. So that's fine. A business plan doesn't always need to be a long, complicated document which goes for 40 or 50 pages and which sits on a shelf after you finished it and you look at it in 12 months' time. It's fine for it to be a living document which you're using on an ongoing basis. So let's talk about goals. One of the things which we often talk to people when we're talking about the importance of goals and setting them is this idea that if you gave somebody a bow and arrow and you said to them, shoot, their natural response will almost always be, well, at what? Whereas if you gave that same person a bow and arrow and you put them in a room that had a bullseye target at the other end, then you've suddenly given them something to aim at. So in doing that, you've given them a way of actually challenging their skills against something. You've given them a way of measuring their progress. So goals give your efforts a purpose. It's not that all goals are equally as good as each other, though, and so we tend to then really look at helping people to understand how to shape goals in a way which are going to actually be useful for you as an organisation. So there's a few different characteristics of goals that we like to talk about. So the first thing is that goals, we think, should be challenging. Difficult goals tend to lead to high performance. The painter Michelangelo apparently once said, "The greatest danger for most of us lies in lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving the mark. So it's better to set goals for yourself which are going to encourage you to actually, lead to higher performance, rather than setting things which are easily attainable and just hitting those mediocre goals. The second thing around the characteristics of a good goal that we believe is that they should be specific. So they need to be detailed, they need to be direct, they need to be meaningful. And lastly, a good goal needs to be measurable. So making something measurable means that you can create a feedback channel and actually make adjustments to the strategies and behaviors that you're engaging to achieve that goal in some way. One of the acronyms that you may have come across if you've worked in corporate environments, especially if you've ever been asked to manage the performance indicators for staff who report to you, you might have come across the idea of SMART goals. And so SMART in this instance stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So they're a slightly extended version of those three core areas of focus that we often talk about. Specific and measurable, those first two, we've already touched on those. Attainable is relating to the idea of challenging. So it suggests that while the goal should be realistic, it should also be that you should actually, that while the goal has to be realistic, that you need to actually have the resources to achieve it as well. Relevant, that's a slightly new category. It's not something that we've just touched on. So relevant, it really says that your goals should relate to your company's mission. When it comes to business planning, I feel that that is kind of already implied, but when you're talking about middle managers managing staff, then it's worth intruding that idea into the process. So if you're managing a team of people and you're asking your staff to then manage down to another team of people, then making sure that the goals that they are setting are relevant to your overall plans actually absolutely makes sense to have that. But again, when you're doing goals for your business itself, then they're naturally inherently relevant to what it is that you're working on. And the last one there is time-based, which we've talked about before. That is, you should be able to set a deadline or to achieve the goal. So it's just another way of being able to measure it. So being able to ensure that there is a level of measurability to those goals. Goals affect behaviours and outcomes in four main ways. So the first thing they do is that they is around choice. Goals narrow the attention that you have, and they direct your efforts to goal-relevant activities away from perceived undesirable or goal-irrelevant activities. And so they narrow your focus down to acting on those things which are aligned to your goals. The second thing they do is that they increase the amount of effort that you put into things. So for instance, if you typically produce 4 widgets an hour and you have the goal of producing 6 widgets an hour, then you may work more intensely towards that goal than you would otherwise. It allows you to put extra effort in, or your team to put extra effort into hitting a goal. You'll often hear the idea of a stretch target, for instance, when you're talking about financial targets. So you'll have your normal target, which is achievable, and then you might have a stretch goal or a stretch target, which is with that extra effort is something which you know that you can achieve, but you just need to put a bit more time and effort into achieving. Persistence is another characteristic of how goals affect behaviours. So you're more likely to work through setbacks if you're pursuing a goal. If you don't have a set goal and you're just working towards something and you encounter some sort of setback or adverse conditions, you might just give up and not continue to push forward because you haven't got an end in mind, which is what you're heading towards. Whereas if you have that goal set, then it allows you to be more persistent and more tenacious and work through those setbacks that you might encounter. And lastly, cognition. So the way in which you think. Goals can lead individuals to change, develop and change their behaviours. So because you have set a goal, it changes the way in which you approach and think about doing things. And so it's beneficial in that sense, in that it helps you change the way in which you actually perceive and think about what it is that you're doing. So ultimately, business success is about setting goals for your business in order to drive towards some sort of metric of success. Now, while goals have got different timeframes and are sometimes are only one step on a path, your macro goals generally are definable points in the future that you can work backwards from. So So some goals are going to be fairly short term, whereas other ones, these sort of very top line goals, when we were talking about top line planning earlier, that's what I was referring to. These highly definable future points which you're aiming towards tend to be at some point in the future. They may be 3 or 4 years down the track, but there's something which you can work backwards from. So a good example of this, when I worked in media, was a business which I came into work with the CEO of that business. When I sat down with him for the first time, he said, look, I really want to sell this business for $10 million in 5 years. And that was great because we had a very clear understanding of what it was we were working towards, and we could work backwards from where we were at that point, which was a business which was kind of just scraping by and breaking even or losing a bit of money. But we knew we needed to grow it to something which could be sold for $10 million in 5 years' time. So that was very useful. And in that instance, we took 6 years to sell it, but we sold it for 12 million. So we kind of, didn't quite hit the target that we'd set for, but it gave us that same trajectory that we were working towards, which was really useful. So yeah, if you know where it is that you are now and you know where you want to end up, then we can work backwards from that end point to figure out the steps of the journey to get there. The milestones along your journey from your current state to your future state provide the guidelines and the rails that your plan's then going to operate within. So they provide the framework that helps you keep heading in the right direction rather than meandering off down some side alley or cul-de-sac. So when we talk about business planning being narratives, which you'll hear us talking about sometimes, they're not stream of consciousness, not writing, where we don't know where we're going to end up. Really what we're trying to do is tell the story about how we're going to get from where we are to that end point. And so it helps us to craft the narrative of what that goal needs to look like or what that plan needs to look like. It's important to think of, as part of this thinking, to think about what the future might look like. So I can tell you with absolute certainty that while some elements of what the future is going to look like will look very similar to the present, there's going to be a lot that does change. Humans are unique in that we have the capacity to imagine lots of different futures and make guesses about which ones are most likely to occur compared to others. And we're not always going to get it right, but if we take that effort to really consider what might actually change in the future, then we can start to plan on things. Then what we absolutely know is that the future is going to be different from how it is today, and that if we tried to assume that the business that we're operating within is going to be exactly the same in a few years' time of how it is today, then we absolutely know that we're wrong on that basis. So it's absolutely important to consider what the future might look like and how we need to address those sorts of changes so that we can make sure that our business is continuing to be relevant and meet those changing criteria of the environment we're working within. So what are some useful frameworks that we can use when we're trying to figure out what our goals should look like? One of the first starting points that we often use is encouraging people to look at the environment that we're working within. So there's a few different ways in which we do that. What we know, for instance, from what we've just been going through over the last few months is that the world significantly changes sometimes. Certainly the world that we are operating in January and February is significantly different from where we are today. So understanding the environment that we are operating in is critically important for a business. The environment that we're operating in today, you can see the impact that it's having on business. And so it's not anything to do with the inherent strengths and weaknesses of the businesses themselves. It's almost all driven in this instance by the environment that they're operating within. So being aware of that environment and helping to using that information to help shape the goals and how you're planning your business is incredibly important. It's really easy for businesses to develop what we call muscle memory of how we've always done things. And that's really useful if you're learning how to drive a car or play a musical instrument, but it's not so great when the fundamentals of the environment that you're operating your business in suddenly shift. All of a sudden, all of those things that you're unconsciously competent in doing may not be appropriate for the new environment you're operating within. So how do we avoid wandering into tar pits like dinosaurs? Well, we start by doing a very broad scan of the new environment. So if you've ever sat in on any of the sessions which I've ever done on business planning in the past, you may be familiar with some of these tools. So just indulge me as I run through them again. But even if you've used these tools in the past, even as recently as 5 or 6 months ago, the fundamental shifts in the environment we're operating in are significant enough that it's actually worth doing these again now and starting with a blank piece of paper and running through this process again, because the world has really changed. So any environmental analysis that you might have done up until now probably is going to be out of date. So let me back up for a moment. What's an environment scan or an environment analysis? When we think about our business, we're not just an isolated island in the middle of the Pacific. We're an active participant in a very dynamic environment, which is constantly evolving and changing with different pressures and catalysts, all reacting to each other, and creating new opportunities for our business. So oftentimes these changes may seem to take a very long time, and oftentimes they do take a very long time. If we do a scan of a business environment one day and generally we do the same scan a year later, you'll find that a few things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same. But sometimes there are periods where we go through considerable upheaval, and that's where changes happen very rapidly. And not being aware of what those changes are and how they're going to actually impact on our business can be quite catastrophic. So to understand how we can run a resilient and sustainable business, we really need to start by zooming right out and considering the environment that we're operating within. So I'll step through each of these 5 points one by one. Firstly, it's worth thinking about what does the future actually look like. So how are people consuming media? So what's changed in our environments? So how are people consuming media? So we've seen in recent months there has been a fairly significant change in the uplift of people using streaming services at home. Television audiences have grown back up to levels which we haven't seen for a very long time. But platforms are being used differently. The people who are actually spending money on those platforms is also changing, and the way in which audiences engaging with those platforms are all fundamentally shifting. So there's all sorts of things which are shifting in that sort of environment, which are worth considering. And these are just some of the sorts of things which you might want to consider when we're going through and doing these first bits of analysis as to what's changed in the environment. It's important just to note that the last point on this slide is that you shouldn't be scared of change. Change creates opportunities more than anything else. So being able to adapt your business to take advantage of the changes which are occurring in the environment means that you've got a business which is actually going to continue to be relevant and be able to weather these sorts of downturns in economic environments, because you've created something which actually is adaptable to the needs of the environment that it's operating within. So the first tool that we often use is this thing which you might have heard me talk about before, called a pest analysis. So this is very much a macro view of the environment that you're operating in. We're not talking about your business at this point. We're really just talking about the environment that you're operating in. So pest, political, economic, social, and technological. What sorts of things are we considering in each of those? So in the political quadrant, generally we just draw this up as if you take a piece of paper and you just draw it across in the middle of it. So you've got 4 quadrants. Then you can start populating bullet point ideas into each of those quadrants, or you can do it on a whiteboard as well, of course. So politically, sorts of things that we're looking at is what's happening in terms of changing the legislation, or what future legislation do we think might be happening. So that may be changes to offset legislation, for instance. It may be changes to quotas. If there's any international legislation which is likely to impact on us. So at the moment, closed borders may be part of all of that, for instance. Regulatory bodies and processes, how that's playing into things. Government policies. So again, travel right now is probably a really significant government policy element, which is worth being aware of. If the government, the term of government and whether it's likely to change, that's often an important thing to consider, because there often will be changes to policies when you have got a significant change in government. Trading policies, so in particular if there's co-production treaties and things like that, or other forms of trading policies which might exist. Funding and grants and initiatives which are politically driven, so In our sector, in particular, the screen sector, there is a lot of grant and support which is provided by government. So how that's likely to change over time is really important to be aware of. Home market pressures, international market pressures, things like that. So these are all the things which sit in our political spectrum. In the economic quadrant, then what we're really looking at is economy trends. So are we heading into a recession? Are we in the middle of a recession? What does that look like? What do overseas economies look like compared to our own? What does the taxation environment look like? Is there any specific tax issues which relate to us? So things like EMDG or R&D or the offsets, the various offsets which are specific to the film industry. Seasonality issues, market cycles or trends, specific industry factors, distribution trends, how interest rates or exchange rates are playing into what's happening with us. So at the moment, for instance, when we look at Australia, we've got particularly low interest rates, exchange rates, so which makes this a favourable operating environment for internationals. But at a political level, that may be prohibited because we can't have people travelling internationally and so on at the moment. But we may still be able to be doing work for people in other ways remotely. So how does all of that work? From a social perspective, that social quadrant, we're really looking then at lifestyle trends, demographics, shifting consumer attitudes and opinions, law changes which affect social factors, privacy, things like that. So how do those sorts of things play into it? Consumer buying patterns. So what are people actually buying and purchasing, and how are they consuming things at the moment? So that shift, for instance, towards paid SVOD services compared to free-to-air, how does that play into our industry? Major events and influences at a social level, buying access and trends, advertising, publicity, ethical issues, all sorts of trends happening in that social space. We also see in there, for instance, the way in which different demographics are consuming media differently is a really important part of social trends which affect how we go about creating content, where we're having a stratification of younger audiences watching content on streaming and digital services, with then older audiences using more traditional television, cinema, things like that. And so how does that sort of all play out in terms of social behaviours? And the last quadrant here is technological. So what are the competing technologies which are out there? What's happening in terms of development of technologies? What research funding is available? Are there any replacement technologies which are coming down the pipeline which are going to fundamentally shift our business? So is there a particular time? So edit suites are a really good example of something which historically have changed in the technological space, where they were incredibly expensive to install an edit suite, and then over a very short period of time it became very, very cheap to be able to buy that sort of technology. And so we had a replacement of more mature technology with emerging technologies. How does all that play into what we're working on? Information and communications tools. So, we've discovered over the last few months just how robust some of the video conferencing technology which is out there is now, and how it can fundamentally shift the way in which we can engage with each other. And that happens both at a domestic and an international level. Technology legislation, the potential for innovation, technology access, so who can actually access this, access to license and patents and intellectual property, all those sorts of things all play into there. So this is very much a very top-line view of the environment we're operating in, but it's important to do because there's no point in creating products and services that the market's actively trending away from. So if you decided in the late noughties, for instance, that you wanted to get into CD manufacturing, it's probably because you hadn't done a proper environment scan before you thought about doing that. So when you start doing these sorts of pest analysis, it's really important, as I said earlier, just to not look at this for your own business. We're really just looking at the environment that you're operating in. So when I say you're not trying to look at the specific technology within your business, you're looking at the environment that you're operating in as opposed to anything else. So what are the things which are likely to impact? Because we start drilling down into your own business in some of these next analyses that we do. Once we've completed that macro scan of the operating environment, then we need to start looking at ourselves, and you're probably more familiar with these sorts of models. So SWOT analysis is probably the one which we use in the first instance. We've included, we will have available for you after this some templates for you to be able to download from a Dropbox link, which we'll provide later in either after this session, or I don't think we've got the link live on the page. No, we don't. So yeah, we'll give you some samples of what these things look like in a PDF form, so you can download these and use them yourself moving forward. The next one, yes, we were talking about is a SWOT. So this is where we actually start then looking specifically at our own business and what that looks like. So the first two things at the top of a SWOT, same sort of thing. We divide a piece of paper or a whiteboard up into 4 quadrants, and the first top two, which we tend to use this sort of format. You'll see them written in all sorts of different formats, but we tend to do them in the quadrant format. Top 2, strengths and weaknesses, are specifically looking at your own business. So within your business, what are we good at? What are we bad at? What are our capabilities? What are our skills deficits? What do we have a good reputation for? What do people not perhaps come to us for? So this is absolutely, that top section is your own business. The bottom section here then is probably data which we're going to draw upon from having done our pest analysis. And these are the opportunities and threats that we can think of for our business, which are based on what it is that we know is happening in the broader environment. So by having thought about that broader environment, that will allow us to then consider what these opportunities and threats are that are relevant to us. So at this point, again, we're just listing everything out. We're not trying to prioritize anything. We're not trying to come up necessarily with solutions. We're just doing this analysis piece. We're doing this research piece to really map out who we are and how we relate to our environment. What you'll find when you get to the opportunities and threats section in particular is that you'll often find that when you're writing an opportunity or a threat, that you're not necessarily sure which side of the page to put it on, because the flip side of many opportunities looks like a threat, and the flip side of a threat looks like an opportunity, and that's fine. So you can put both of them in there. But they're not always mutually exclusive. When you identify a threat, it sometimes means there's also an opportunity around that, and vice versa. So oftentimes this is just the one document or the one type of analysis that people do when they're doing their business planning activities. And it's useful, but it doesn't actually tell us anything other than just where we are right now. It doesn't allow us to step forward and then consider how we take this information and use that within our own business. So what we encourage people to do is the next step beyond this, which is what we call a SWOT action plan. So in a SWOT action plan, we start to, and this is the bit which I think is the fun part, we start to use the information that we've then determined to inform the strategic direction that we want to head in. So when we look at the list of opportunities and threats that we've come up with, we can then start to compare and align them to the strengths and weaknesses that we have within our own business to start to inform what sort of activities, actions that we need to take in our own business. And so to do this, we start by looking at our strengths and we compare that to our opportunities. And when there's a clear alignment between those two, these become our obvious priorities. These are things we can do immediately. They're going to have a positive impact on our business with minimal change. Then we compare our weaknesses and our opportunities, and these create our attractive options. These are things that we feel that we should be doing, but we may be lacking some sort of capability or skills to undertake. And so the actionable items that we can do here are to build that sort of resource or capability that allows us to take advantage of that opportunity within our business. The next thing we do is we compare our strengths to our threats, and these things are lists of threats which are easily defended. We can use this information to develop mitigation strategies to help us avoid or minimize those threats. And then lastly, we have our weaknesses and our threats, and these are high-risk threats. So these are things which we aren't presently equipped to be able to deal with. And some of those things we may never be able to mitigate against because they're just so far out of our ability to control that we can't do anything about them. With other ones, we may be able to better deal with them by developing capabilities or skills, so addressing some of our weaknesses so that they become strengths of our business so that we can then move them into the easily defended category. So all of this is then around what are the actual actions we can take within our business to then start to move ourselves forward to, based on this piece of analysis that we've done to understand where it is that we sit in our marketplace and where we are as a business. So the SWOT action plan's outcomes are very much activities and actions. They're the things that we need to consider doing in our business based around the information that we've gleaned from the analysis that we've done. Another thing which is often worth doing after you've completed your SWOT action plan is to then map out where your business sits in your immediate business environment. And so to do this, what we generally do is we plot out a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. And I'm just giving a really simple example here. And the characteristics that you choose to put on each of those axes is going to be different depending on how you're comparing yourself to your competitors. So what characteristics you choose to map will be dependent on your business and what you identify as being the key differentiators between you and your competitors. Ideally, your axes need to exist on a continuum. So there's one end of the spectrum, a low and a high, or not very, and so they need to be something which is a logical continuum. They may be things like what we've put in here, so quality of work or price point, but they also may be things like creativity. So how creative is the output of a business, or what's the reputation of a business? It can also be things like, although it's harder to map a continuum for this, things like target markets. So are we focusing very much on a domestic market? So it might be from hyperlocal to international, might be the continuum you want to use on that sort of target market sort of spectrum. So again, it's important to sort of consider these on a number of different terms. So what are the differentiators between you and your competitors that you're going to use to map things out? When you do map out your competitors on a graph like this, what you tend to find, and this is just a dummy one I put up on screen, is that you tend to get clusters of businesses in particular areas, and then you find that there's gaps in the market in other areas. So what we can sort of see here, for instance, when we're mapping cost and quality, is we normally find there's a few businesses which they tend to align along that diagonal, so that when you look from low to high, that we sort of see businesses naturally lying along a diagonal from that spectrum, and that kind of makes sense. So we have low cost, low quality, going up to high cost, high quality, and there tends to be no businesses that sort of sit in this low quality, high price point, or high quality, low price point quadrants. Yes, there's absolutely gaps in the market for those types of business, but in this instance, there's no market or business model that can really service those gaps. So just because there is a gap in that market doesn't necessarily mean that you can create a business which is going to be able to service those environments. But yeah, these sorts of clustering of activities is often how we sort of see these this competitor analysis work out. And what it can allow you to do is to identify that there may be some segment of the market which is being underserviced, or some segment of the market which is being overserviced, and you can look at whether or not there's an opportunity for you to fill some of those gaps in those spaces where you can see that there logically is still an opportunity to build a business in those spaces. So a quick recap on environment scans. If you're writing your plan for somebody external from your business, what an environment scan demonstrates to people who are reading your plan is that you've really considered your environment and done your homework. What a competitive analysis really allows you to do is to start to avoid building businesses in areas where there aren't market opportunities. But the flip side of that is that competitor analysis and environment scans often will help us try to find opportunities where there's a white space that we can potentially carve out a niche or take advantage of a shift in environment where there wasn't an opportunity to actually do business previously. Now, we touched on this a little bit in the last session that we did, but we'll go do a slightly deeper dive into this Unsolved matrix. So when we consider businesses and how they can grow, the matrix that we often use when we're considering this is this thing which is up on screen at the moment, which is called an Unsolved matrix. Unsolved matrix was developed back in 1957 by Igor Unsolved. He was a Russian American. He was an applied mathematician, but he was also a business manager. So he was using both his business and his mathematics skills to create this. And the Unsolved matrix suggests there's 4 logical ways of growing a business. So firstly, selling more products, more of your existing product and services within your existing markets. This is called market penetration. It's the bottom left quadrant there. And again, you'll see this written in different ways, where the quadrants might be in different positions, but the same continuum in terms of X and Y axis is tends to be consistent across when you see this being created. So yeah, market penetration is about increasing your market share within your existing market segments. It tends to be characterized by things like aggressive promotion and distribution. Oftentimes, in order for people to get extra market penetration, they decrease prices. Another strategy for increasing your ability to service your existing markets with your existing products is through the acquisition of rivals. So finding people who are operating in a similar space, and by bolting them into your business, you're eliminating competition and making sure that you're owning a larger share of the existing market that you're working within. The next one that we consider is that you could sell your existing products and services into a new market, and this is called market development. So it requires minimal product development or innovation. It's really about finding ways of shifting either from, well, one of the ways which you often will see this happen is a shift from either a business to consumer to business or vice versa. So a good example of this would be in recent times, for instance, that technology products like Zoom, which we've been using for video conferencing, which has been very much a business-to-business type of transactional activity, has now actually started to be used more and more by consumers, for instance. And so an existing product's found a new niche in a new marketplace where it perhaps hadn't played before. It may also be new areas or regions in your domestic market. So you may be working in a very specific territory within the market that you're operating within. So there may be opportunities for you to sell your services and products to other parts of the domestic market. International markets obviously are a big opportunity for many people in the screen industries in particular. So taking your existing products into international markets where they might not know you is a good strategy in terms of growing using market development. Where it works well is where you have a unique product that could work in other territories. And it tends to work in new markets where those new markets are similar in some way to existing ones. So again, when we're thinking about screen content, English language content will probably sell better into markets where English language is the primary language spoken, because it means that market you're trying to sell into, that new market you're trying to sell into, is similar to the one you're already operating within. The third quadrant in the Ansov matrix is around developing new products and services for your existing market. So this is around product development. It tends to be characterized by an investment in research and development. It can be a result of acquiring the rights from somebody else's product for local commercialization. So if there's somebody who's doing something well in the international market or in a territory outside of where you're operating, and you can take their rights for whatever they're doing and locally commercialize them, then that's a good way of doing product development. So buying in somebody else's product and badging it as your own, which is also called white labeling, is another example of how you can do product development rapidly. Or joint venturing with partners who need access to your markets where they're not operating in your existing markets. In terms of the risk profiles for new market development and product development, they're fairly similar. So you've already got a certain amount of skills or capabilities or relationship, or you've got a product or service which you've already developed in both of these, and you're just exploring one additional step outside of what you're currently doing. But the last quadrant that we're looking at, which is about selling new products and services into new markets, is what is called diversification. So we need new skills in order to do that. And we need to have new relationships. So we need to both develop a completely new product and service, and we also need to figure out ways of engaging with those marketplaces. Oftentimes, that's done via acquisition. So because it's highly risky, an acquisition means that you can buy in some of that skills or capability that you perhaps wouldn't have if you tried to do it from the get-go. You do see this happen a little bit with businesses that are getting desperate and where their core business environment has shifted in some way, and so they're trying to fundamentally reimagine their business. When it's done out of desperation, diversification often won't work. Where it does work well is where it's a slightly related business. So, for example, vertical integration. So An example of that would be a distributor buying a production company, or a production company buying a post facility. So you're buying a business which you don't necessarily have the products and services in your own business or the relationships in the marketplace to be able to service those, but because it's a related entity in some way to what you're already doing as part of your supply chain, then it might make more sense to actually do that sort of acquisition. So each of these quadrants has a different risk and a different reward, but the framework's really useful in terms of helping you identify ways in which you might want to think about growing your business. And when you're considering ways, exploring new opportunities and pivoting your business, then having these different ways of thinking can really help shape your planning activities. It's just a way of ideating and helping your thought process to work through these different opportunities. So, for instance, if you're a television producer and you want to explore market development, you would probably consider where emerging markets for your existing products are. So that may be going into another territory around the world, or an emerging platform. You might say, oh, look, Quibi sounds really interesting, might not be doing so well, but it may be an area where you really wanted to explore as a new platform. So you then go through the process of identifying who the potential new customers for your products and services are, and then you can develop strategies to find and engage with those. Or it may be that you want to explore what opportunities exist to sell new products and services to your existing clients. So perhaps not so much the screen industry, but if, for instance, you're a games developer with a highly engaged audience, you might decide it's easier to develop a new product for your existing audience who already know and love your existing games, rather than trying to develop strategies to sell your existing games to new customers or into a new territory. Diversification is the most risky strategy in the Untitled matrix, but it's potentially also the most rewarding, because it allows you to engage in both market penetration and product development activities. So effectively, you're unlocking 3 new avenues to business growth, but it is the hardest and the most intensive to manage. And you do run the risk of losing your existing markets if you pursue that really aggressively. Okay, I think it's probably time for us to take a quick break and have a look at questions and answers which might have come up. So I might see if I can get Richard up on screen here. Might be a second. It's connecting through. I'll jump in there. It says one of these questions here: what was the name of the growth quadrant we just covered off? So the last one there that we covered off there was the diversification quadrant, which was the top right hand side of the screen. I'll just bring that up for you again so you can see what it looks like. So yeah, top right-hand corner here, we have diversification. So this is the one where we're talking about new products and new services. So it's where we're operating in a space where we haven't necessarily got capability or relationships. But in doing so, what it allows us to do is to develop new products and new relationships in new territories. And so yeah, we're sort of tripling the growth opportunities there. But as I say, it's very high risk in that category, because we are really trying to build into an area that we don't necessarily know at that point. Where it's not connecting, it's saying accepted and connecting, but it's just taking a little bit of time here. So what we may do is just take a bit of a break then for everybody to go and have a cup of tea and a bit of a break, and we'll come back in maybe 5 minutes, and we'll kick off with the second half of that session. And hopefully Richard will have joined us by then, and we can just see if there's any thoughts or insights that he has before we start the second half of today.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Not quite sure what happened there, but there you go.
So yes, thank you for moderating those chat questions. Was there some stuff there which we wanted to address in particular?
There's nothing specifically. I just thought I just wanted to go back, when you talk about the line of the quality and cost.
Yep.
I think it may be just worth, I don't know, it just always sticks out to me. It's often worth just talking about production values as opposed to quality.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so the matrix.
It sort of suggests that, that's all. It's a very small thing, but it's just about recognizing that, you look at things like, I don't know, can I ask, what's the one? You can't ask that the ABC show, where you go, that's kind of not bad quality, but it's obviously the beauty of it is it's low cost. I'm imagining for what it is. It's a great concept. Anyway, it's those sorts of things. But in terms of the rest,
back there around where to access data as well, is that right? So
yeah, there's lots. There was just that question about data, which is very obviously pretty tricky.
Yep.
But I guess there is that question. What was the other thing? And did you touch on that bit of that question about that I sent a note about? One of the challenges is obviously trying to change to a new world when you literally don't know what that world's going to look like. So have we touched on that too much?
No, look, I think part of the environment scan activities is really to do that, is to try to consider what is the world likely to look like in the future. And I know it's really difficult in this sort of environment where we just don't know what's going on long term. But it's focusing on the things that we are going to have some certainty around, and that we know that at some point that the market will open up. But what does that mean, for instance? So it's likely that when the market does open, there's going to be some sort of logjam, happening in terms of distributors and broadcasters and platforms wanting to access content. So how can we shape our offering now to take advantage of that? So what does that mean? I suppose it means things like how do we have projects market ready which can be turned around quickly so that content can be created in a really short space of time so that a platform can then take advantage of that as quickly as possible. So that's the sort of things. We can't address the unknown unknowns, but we can try to look at and imagine what can we extrapolate from what we know right now in terms of likelihood.
I guess, which is all good. I and it's a very small point. I just want to say I just want to comfort everyone to feel like it's a weird thing to feel like you're doing planning when in fact everything is obviously so unknown. So in fact, it's almost like it feels like a contradiction in terms that you should be doing planning when in fact it's hard to know. In fact, whereas in fact there's still a value. I guess what I'm trying to just ensure everyone, there's still a value in doing it. There's actually a great value in doing it, and often it's a great moment. It's almost just encouraging them to say, take this moment. Take the moment when there's not the kind of conveyor belt going on, to just sit back. It is, having said that, the paradox of that is obviously the fact that it's harder to plan because you just don't know. But nonetheless, there are things we can think about and walk through. I did actually listen to Joel Perlman talking about Village, and one of the challenges for independent cinema, I think, is going to be once cinemas do come back, there's a pile of big commercial films that they have just held on to. and just not release. So the James Bond films and all these other films. So in terms of these other things, even though production stopped at the moment, there's still going to be, for a period of time, we don't know quite how long, there's just going to be this one after, that they're going to be releasing. So that's it just makes independent cinema even more challenged than
but it'll be
normally. But,
as human behaviours do, whether people continue to embrace premium release SVOD and TVOD in particular moving forward, because even when the world does open up, whether there'll be a reluctance to still go to cinemas. So even if the James Bond movie does hit cinemas, and I'm a massive James Bond fan, I may still be more prepared to spend the $30 to get it on 4K HD at home and watch it with the family rather than put myself at risk. So these sorts of trends will reshape the way in which consumers behave moving forward, which will be interesting to see. But I think it's a really interesting point in terms of, why plan now when there is so much uncertainty? I think that businesses often are at risk of the boiling frog syndrome, that, that they don't plan for long periods of time and the environment continues to change around them for a really long period of time. And then when they actually do try to plan for the environment that's gradually changed, it's too late. They've missed the boat. They haven't kept up with the relevant environmental influences, which they probably should have been aware of. And so taking this opportunity to sort of step back and go, outside of COVID, what has changed in the environments over the last few years, which is relevant to this industry? Because the screen industry in particular, has been through such a period of very quick change and rapid change over the last 5 years in particular, that it's still worth doing.
Oh, look, I think it's all good. I think hopefully, I mean, they haven't all jumped off yet. So should we go back on, do you think? You reckon?
We are live at the moment. They're all listening to you. So.
There you go. Well, I had no idea. There you go. All my secrets. So I mean, that is the paradox of that. I think is a fascinating one, though. It is, and I guess it's a bit like, there's two things to do in the, two clear things to do during a pandemic when you can't do anything else, when there's production has stopped. One is script development, which is everyone is doing as crazy as everything, and I think something that everyone has to realize is that, in fact, hopefully that means that the quality of everything within the next few months is going to be better, because everyone is spending lots of time honing their projects and sharpening them. So it's not good enough to be just good enough anymore, as if it ever was. But everyone will be spending lots of time doing that, but also having these moments to talking about script development. This idea, in fact, planning is a little bit like that, where in fact, just when you start doing it, even if you don't know things, just the actual practice of getting into that business of just constantly asking questions and testing your own assumptions and is just a good practice, even whatever sort of thing that business plan looks like in the end. It's just a good moment to actually spend the time questioning your assumptions.
You're right. And it doesn't need to be, these very detailed formal plans. I mean, the second half of what we're going to get into now is some of those tools that you will use when you're doing more formal plans. And they may still be very useful for people when they're going through planning activities even now, especially around testing the financial validity of new ideas and things like that. So there's some stuff there which I think will be useful for people to have a look at. But I think the point of the business plans don't necessarily have to be these epic tomes. They can be just as relevant for what it is that you need them to be right now, and any sort of planning activity is better than none in that it helps inform strategy. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think, we've talked about this difference that you and I slightly have in terms of mind. It's interesting they dumped in the relevant thing into the smart matrix as well, because I'm a big one of, really these business plans are kind of your story, and that's kind of how I approach them. So it is about, I'm big on, where do you want to be? Who do you want to be? What do you want to look like? What are your values? What do you care about? So that you suddenly find yourself in 5 years going, oh God, we've, headed off this way. So it's constantly just kind of coming back and asking that question about, not only is this a business, but does it actually relate to what we wanted to, who we wanted to be. Some people don't care, that's fine. Some people are purely for the business. But literally looking at the business plan, like you said, in terms of either being a very detailed or not detailed, but ultimately it's about your story of, your story. You're either selling to yourself or selling to other people.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, that's always been, that's kind of, I guess, where I kind of start on a lot of these things. Yeah. There was one other thing, but I can't even remember what it is now.
Okay. Well, look, what we might do, I'll keep pushing on with second half. I think we've probably got most people back. I'm not going to actually kick you off. I'm just going to hide your video and mute you.
Okay.
So when I come to add you back in at the end, it'll just be easier for me to turn you back on again.
Yeah, great. No worries.
All right. Thank you very much. Just mute Richard as well. There we go. Excellent. Okay, on to part 2 of today's session. Is really getting into, as I was saying just then, starting to have a look at some of the tools which you might want to use when you are doing one of those slightly more formal business plans, but they're also useful tools just generally, even if you're using this purely for yourself. So firstly, let's touch on some of the elements that you would include in a formal business plan and that you would be showing to somebody external from the business. So what Richard was just mentioning there is that business plans are ultimately stories. They're admittedly somewhat different from your traditional narrative structure in some ways, but at the end of the day, they need to maintain an internal coherence and cohesion in the way that a traditional story does. Unlike most stories, you're going to probably give the end away right at the beginning. But I suppose it's more like the blurb on the back of a novel, but it's just got a lot more detail. So that's your executive summary, which we normally put at the front of a formal plan. And that's really the crib notes or the cheat sheets, so that if somebody only reads that section of the plan, they're still going to have a pretty good idea of who you are and what you're doing and where you're going and how you're planning on getting there. A few of the other elements that you would only ever include in a formal business plan for an external party, which you wouldn't ever bother doing for yourself, are things like the history of your business and your background. If you're writing a plan for yourself and it's an informal one, you already know your own history and background. You don't need to worry with all of that. You'll also need to provide a detailed market analysis. So when you're doing your pests and your SWOTs and your SWOT action plans, your competitor maps and all those sorts of things, they're all really useful. But in your own version, where you're probably going to do those activities and then just keep them in draft form, you won't necessarily have done anything other than just kept that as a bullet point type of document which you've scribbled on. When you get into your formal business plan, you then go through the process of actually writing a written narrative explaining each of those core bullet points and what the key learnings that you've distilled from those activities. So you'll distill that information down into a few paragraphs to explain what it is. And then you may include that source data, those SWOTs and pests and things, as appendices to your document, but so people can see you're working effectively, but they're really looking at in a formal business planning sense, just what have you learned from having done those activities. The other thing in a formal business plan you need to do is to probably, and again, you wouldn't necessarily do this for yourself, it's still useful to do, but is to really clearly describe and articulate your core proposition or propositions about how you're going to grow or evolve or improve or better your business in some way, and provide a level of detail around what that means for you and why it's important, tied back to that environmental analysis piece that you've done, and what the outcomes for your business are going to be as a result of doing those things. So again, when you're doing an informal plan for yourself and you have a sense of the direction you're heading in, then you're very much doing just planning the actions that you're using to move towards that, whereas in the formal business plan, you're really having to describe that. You also need to probably describe the resources that you're going to need to undertake your activities, especially if those new resources are going to bring new capabilities or skills to your business that you don't currently have. So especially when we're going back to that ANSW matrix, if they're providing relationships into new markets and territories, or they're providing capacity to create new products and services, it's worth articulating that really clearly as to what those skills are. And those resources may be people, or they might be training that you want to undertake, or they might be bits of equipment, or they might be extra cash or capital. Again, they all have to relate back to whatever your core idea is. And the last bit, which you will almost always need in a formal business plan, is your financial forecast. Now, I would always advocate, even if you're doing a business plan for yourself, even if it's informal, you still want to have financial forecasts. I think they're incredibly useful and valuable. But oftentimes people won't go through the process of doing a very detailed financial forecast, because there is a lot of effort involved in doing these. But when it comes to a formal one, especially when it's for somebody external from your business, looking at it from a grant assessment, from a loan assessment, from an investment assessment, they're absolutely going to be looking at that really, really closely. So using maths to really bring those new resources into your business, using maths, showing how those new resources are going to impact on your business and going to drive better financial outcomes for your business is really important. So they're the key elements which we really need to make sure in a formal business plan, which you might not necessarily have in one which you're writing for yourself. Next element that you'll often see included in a formal business plan, which you'll be asked to include if you're being provided a template by somebody for a grant or things like that, is some sort of statement that succinctly articulates the purpose or intent of your organisation. So that might be a company mission or a company vision statement. That's often called, those things. They're slightly different from each other. Sometimes it's an elevator pitch or a stump speech. You might have heard those terms as well. It's useful in terms of helping you to really identify what we call brand essence. So the exercise I put up on screen here is one that we use in brand essence workshops to help articulate how we think about a business and describe it. And so the way in which you use this particular little tool is kind of similar to your SWOTs and so on. So it's ultimately still a quadrant type of matrix here that we're working with. And in no particular order, you can jump into any of these quadrants as you're thinking about your business. But and ideally we just want short words or sentences when you're filling this in, as opposed to long paragraphs. Firstly, we really want to think about top left-hand corner there, what it is we do. So what's the actual reason for the business? What are the things that the business actually does? So being able to just use words or sentences to describe that and how you want the business to be perceived is really important in this part. The second one, which is top right-hand corner, is your culture. So what's the personality of your business? This is a very emotive type of words and phrases to encapsulate what your business is. Oftentimes we encourage people to think about a character or a personality which embodies a corporate culture. So, my business is a lot like Michelle Obama's, or, like Michelle Obama, or my business is like Superman, or whatever the case may be. But, what are the characteristics of this character or personality, which kind of really, if you personified your business, who would it be, or what would it look like? So that's in that cultural section. The next one is your unique proposition. So what is it that sets you apart from your peers and competitors? What's unique about your business? What are your unique sales propositions or selling propositions? So how do you clearly differentiate yourself from what other people who you consider as competitors or peers? What are the elements which make you special about your business? And then the bottom right-hand corner is the quadrant of what's your source of authority. So why do people believe you when you say that you can do what you do? Why do people believe in your capabilities? Is it that you've won awards? Is it that you've got a good track record of doing this? Is it because you've done something similar in a different space? So what's your source of authority that gives you the mandate from the industry or from your clients to believe that you're going to be able to do what you say you're going to do? So mapping each of those sorts of 4 quadrants out. The next thing that we generally do is to go through all of the different words you put on a page there and circle or highlight those in some ways. The ones which really stand out, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 in each of those quadrants, which really, really clearly for you personify the essence of what it is that your business is, and really are probably the most critical elements for each of those. And then what we try to do is to then bring those together into the center in that circle in the middle and try to write a phrase, a single sentence or a paragraph, which really combines all of those elements into a unified whole. So you've got one sentence there, which really helps to describe what it is. So the whole purpose of this exercise is, as I say, you will often be asked to consider what's your mission or vision statement for your business. And this is just a way of helping you, giving you a framework to start to think about the elements of your business that you want to articulate when you're thinking about that, so that you can put that together into a single phrase. As I say, mission and vision statements are a little bit different. It's worth doing a bit of Googling. There's a huge amount of information out there on the internet as to examples of what those all look like. But we use this as what we call a brand essence sort of exercise to really help to understand in a really succinct form how you could go about describing your business and what it is that you do. All right, so when you're thinking this is the next thing that we really want to drill down into in terms of other activities which are worth doing from a business planning activity, especially around the formal ones, is financial metric testing. So when you're thinking about how viable a new idea or a proposition is likely to be from a financial perspective, it can be really useful to have a tool that allows you to rapidly test a number of different financial metrics and variables to see what that means in terms of bottom line profitability. And the tool that we most commonly use to do this is this thing called the backwards planning finance model. Now, we will provide a copy of one of these in a template form for you in the Dropbox link, which we will then share with you at some point after this. And so you can sort of jump in. There'll be an Excel model there you can have a play with to sort of see how it works. But yeah, a backwards planning model it's a financial model that allows us to work backwards from that desired end state, which we generally define in some form of profitability. And then by manipulating a very simple set of variables to underpin the business model, we can then test various scenarios to see what's required to achieve our desired end state. So yeah, as I say, there is a template available, and it hopefully will be relatively, we've color coded it so that all the blue cells, the ones which you can sort of go in and play around and put your own data into, and then it'll kind of spit out some metrics for you to sort of understand how successful a particular business model is likely to be. So the data you need to be able to start this process. So there's a few questions you need to ask yourself, and again, it'll make more sense when you have a look at the actual Excel model itself. But the very first starting point is, where do you want your intended future profit to be? So how profitable do you want your business to be? The one that we're going to provide you with is over a 5-year horizon. So in 5 years' time, what do you want your future profit to be? And what's your starting profit? So what do you anticipate your profit for the next 12 months? And you could use column 1 as the year, which is just finished as well, or just about to finish in terms of financial years, if you wanted to actually start year 1 as being using hard data from where you actually are. Then the 5th column across will be 4 years in the future in that instance. But what's your starting profit? What's your ending profit? Is really important. That's the top left-hand corner of the model. You'll fill that in. Then we're getting into beyond that is then what are the products and services you want to sell? So what we're trying to do is to then break down products and services into classifiable chunks. So that may be where you either group like types of projects together if they have similar financial metrics around them. So the specific financial metrics we need to address for each product and service type that you're doing is, how much are we selling this thing for? So, is it a $1.5 million, cheap feature film, or is it a $600,000 documentary, for instance? So you're starting to classify these things into product types. What are the margins that I'm anticipating to make off it? So what's the actual returns that I intend to make off this project or service? So that's probably going to be set as a percentage. So I might be setting myself a 10 or 15% margin target for a particular product which I'm selling. So you'll nominate that. And then you'll also need to consider, what are the fixed resource costs which I need to within my business? So this is outside of variable deliverable costs. What are the things which I need to be considering, which are things like rent and overheads and so on? Leave staff to one side for a second, but what are the fixed business costs which I'm going to have on an annual basis to be able to deliver just to be able to run my business? So we'll drop that into the model. And then lastly, what are the human resource costs? So this is our staffing costs. So what are the human resource costs, full-time staff members I'm going to bring on board, I'm actually going to pay wages to? So we'll drop all of that data into the model. And then lastly, what we start to do is manipulate the volume of how many products and services we think we're going to be able to sell. So by playing around with different volume targets, we can then start to determine the right mix of activities we need to hit those bottom line goals that we've set ourselves. So it's worth noting that you may want to increase your fixed overheads, both in terms of general business overheads and human resources over time. And we've allowed in the model some percentage increases you can start to play around with there to be able to drop various iterations of what that might look like into there. But really, once you've set your baseline in terms of here are the products and services which I'm intending on delivering, the key thing you're really playing around with is the volume of each of those. So what you really want to understand is, if I were to deliver one of these each year, what does that mean for my business? If I could deliver one of product A each year and one of product B every second year, what does that mean for my business? And so it allows you to very rapidly test the combinations of products and services by volume to understand what the actual bottom line impact that's going to have. And by having some fixed overheads in there, both in terms of company overheads and staff overheads, it allows us to then really very quickly test these different scenarios. What it's also useful to do is to save lots of different versions of this, so you can sort of play around with different types of variations on those volumes in particular, and see what that means. So why is this useful? I suppose what it allows you to do is to very quickly validate your top line business model before you spend a lot of time going in and drilling down to creating a really detailed finance model. And a detailed finance model is absolutely important when you're building something for an investor or a bank or a screen agency to look at if you're being asked to provide a business plan for any of those. But if you're doing it for yourself, really what you really want to understand is, does this business model actually genuinely, is it sustainable? Is the volume of output that I need to be putting through my business feasible? And when I look at the volume of what I need to do, can I hand over heart believe that I can genuinely deliver this in the business? And what does that mean in terms of profitability? So you can use your backwards planning tool to do all of that testing without having to get into the really detailed, 3-year, 5-year finance projections that you probably want to do as part of a more structured sort of process. So again, what we will do is make that a copy of that model available to you. I won't try to bring that up on screen because it was a bit complicated when I tried to do that last time, and I don't want to kill this the screen shares. But we will absolutely make that model available for you to play around with. And then as you go through it, if you've got any questions, just reach out to me and I can help talk you through what that might look like. So financial metric testing, yeah, to begin with, start with a very top line model before you start drilling down into the more detailed versions of them, which you might need to do for a more formal one. If you're just doing informal planning, top line models are probably fine just to validate the business model that you're testing to begin with. Moving on to marketing. So marketing is one of those things that oddly people in creative industries tend to not like doing, and so they avoid doing it, which is odd because marketing in and of itself is actually a creative activity. But you might have heard the quote from Mark Twain about that if you've got it's the frog quote where he talks about that if you have to eat a frog, you should do it first thing in the morning. If you have to eat 2 frogs, you should eat the biggest one first. So you often hear in business speak people talking about eating the frog, which means that if you've got a task that you actually have to do, you should put it at the top of your to-do list and make sure you do that first thing in the morning before you get on to anything else, because it means that you'll actually be able to get on and get the rest of your tasks done. Anyway, the point of all that is that marketing is often the frog that people don't want to eat, but they really need to eat when it comes to creative businesses. Marketing doesn't need to be complicated or painful. So by starting with a fairly simple framework, it's easy to actually develop an appropriate marketing plan for your business and then chunk down the activities that you need to undertake into manageable and assignable portions, so you can set those within your action plans, for instance. The first thing that we need to do when we're thinking about a marketing plan is to start by thinking about who we actually need to be marketing to. So who are the people who are actually likely to be buying our products and services, or at least being influenced by our marketing? So we start just with a piece of paper or a whiteboard. A lot of people spend a lot of time marketing to audiences who simply don't care about their marketing messages. There's no point in telling all of your competitors or peers in the industry how good you are or how awesome your product or services are if they're never going to buy from you. If they're your competitors, they're not going to buy from you. So once you've identified who you need to be marketing to, and again, ideally these are people who are actually going to buy from you or at least influence that decision, then we need to start thinking about the appropriate marketing channels we have at our disposals to actually start reaching them. And these are going to vary from business to business, but many of them will be the same. So they may well be, your website, electronic direct mail, there may be social media. There's a whole bunch of range of things, networking events, market attendance, all sorts of things like that. So writing out all of those channels and understanding what those are is really important. Then the next point after you've done that, you've got your target audiences. Who do I need to be marketing to? What are the channels that I need to be using to be able to reach these people? Is we start to marry these up against each other. So we want to marry our marketing channels to our target audience. It's really important to be realistic here. So if you don't really think that the head of commissioning at a US streaming service is going to be following you on Facebook, then don't try to use that as the channel to reach them. It's not going to work. But being realistic about how that's going to work is really important. Now you have to think about the purpose of what each of those channels. So why are you using that channel to reach your audience? What are you actually trying to do with that particular marketing channel? Is it about raising awareness or actually directly selling something? So by identifying the rationale for what each marketing channel is that you're going to use to reach the audience, in order to determine, what it allows you to do is to determine the content that you should be putting within that channel. So you will then create the right type of content for that channel for the purpose that you're intending to use it for. And then the next thing we need to think about is the frequency. So I've written cadence in the notes here, but how frequently do we actually, what's the regularity of using that channel? So again, it's important to be realistic with this. You're better to do small amounts of regular activities constantly than binging in large amounts of activities over short periods of time. Now, that doesn't, as a general rule, that's what you want to do. You may want to choose to engage in some very tactical targeted events at particular times of year, around events, for instance. So if you're about to go to a market, you might want to increase your presence in the general social media space by writing a bunch of LinkedIn articles over a few months. So there's a body of work which is there, which is quite relevant and current. But that's a tactical decision that you might choose to make. But generally, what we're looking at is that small amounts of regular activities tend to work better than large amounts of burst-like binge activities. So last, we want to figure out the person who's going to actually be responsible for engaging in the activity and describe the process they're going to use. It doesn't need to be you necessarily as the person who's actually going to engage in those marketing activities. You may well decide to allocate that to a staff member, or you may have a third party outside of your organization that you can engage to provide those services as well. So figuring out who's going to use each of those channels can be really useful as well, because some people will have a natural propensity or capacity to use some of those channels better than others. We have also provided in the Dropbox, when we give you that link, a sample marketing communications matrix just to get you started on your marketing activities, so that you can sort of see the format that we often use for these types of things, so you can start to fill it in. Again, having a framework can make life much easier for people. You don't need to start with a blank page. You can start with our template, and then hopefully that will make life a little bit easier when you're starting to consider all of that. But by breaking that down into manageable, assignable tasks, then you can set both yourself and your team specific actions to undertake on an ongoing basis to make that whole process simpler and more pain-free. So it's also important just to mention that that the effectiveness of your marketing activities should be measurable. So you really do want to try to measure whether or not they're having the impact that you're intending them to have, and having some sort of expectation of what success looks like in advance of engaging any of these activities is also important. So you actually then know, as you're measuring things, whether you've achieved the outcomes that you wanted to. And there's lots of tools out there which you can use to measure these metrics. So learn about those, things like Google Analytics, but there's also other, depending on the marketing channel, there's all sorts of different tools which you can use to measure that effectiveness and and it's well worth your time to understand how those tools work and how it's going to work for you from your marketing activities. All right. Going back to your brand essence for a moment, one of the things which is useful when you have clearly understood what it is that your business is and what you stand for, is then makes it easier for you to start thinking about the sorts of projects that you feel that you should be working on and why you should be working on them. Now, again, this may well start to come from your marketplace analysis as well. So the tools you've used to evaluate where you sit in the market and what's going on in the environmental level may also help feed into the types of projects that you feel that you should be working on at the moment. But also whether or not it aligns with your brand, because you don't want to be confusing the market by going and pitching projects which don't necessarily align with what it is that you stand for. Some businesses have got very diverse and varied slates, and that sometimes can confuse the market and the people they're pitching to. So where you do have a good alignment between your projects and your brand, that does tend to mean that your clients can understand what it means to be engaging with you on one of your projects. It's important for each of your, for each creative, well, for every creative business is going to vary, but over the years, the criteria that we've sort of seen people start to think about when they're trying to assess whether or not a project is the right fit for their business, especially in the creative industries, are questions like IP ownership. So who owns what rights? So, or the quality of the creative. So what's the quality or pedigree of the writer or the creator on a particular project, and how does that align with the type of projects that we make? The other things which you often use when you're assessing whether or not a project's right for your business is, are there any intangible benefits that this project's going to bring to you? Is it going to help you develop a particular relationship or demonstrate capabilities or credentials in the space that you haven't operated in before by collaborating with a third party? Or is there some other intangible benefit that this project brings to your organisation? The scale of the project, how big the project is again an important one to consider, and making sure that it's appropriate for what your brand is and for the type of business that you are running. But also, you know, it needs to align with what your ambitions for your business are. So if you're doing lots of small projects and you're getting frustrated by the fact that your business isn't generating enough profit, maybe you should be considering doing larger turnover projects and seeing what that means. And if that's part of your goals, then it may be part of your assessment criteria when you're considering whether a project should actually fit with what you're doing. One of the ones which often comes up, which is almost impossible to measure, but which you will probably have an innate sense of, is whether or not the project fits within the zeitgeist. So is there something about this particular project which you feel really resonates with social trends at the moment? And again, this can kind of come out from your pest analysis right at the very beginning there, when you're looking at social trends or technological trends. Is there something about this project which really clearly taps into a strain of interest which is happening at a social level, or which is of interest to you, or which you feel has got some sort of X factor around the project which makes it really interesting? Market demand is really important for many people. So do we know that this type of project, there actually is a demand for it in the marketplace? And it's not necessarily is there a demand for this project in the marketplace today. It's also about what Richard was talking about earlier, looking ahead and saying, what do I think the world might look like in the future? So can I create something which is going to align with what market demand in the future might look like? So right now we know that that we're hearing that people are really looking for light type of programming as opposed to anything dark and heavy. That's absolutely what people are looking for right now. And so market demand for what people are pitching right now needs to align with that. But obviously 6 months, 12 months down the track, that might change. So trying to have some good guesses as to what market demand might look like in the future is also really important. Profitability of projects. So not necessarily tied to turnover. So some projects are more inherently profitable than others. The way in which you do projects can be more profitable in some circumstances. So co-productions, for instance, will generally throw off a lower profit than something which you're doing completely by yourself. But a co-production may provide an intangible benefit that you can't have by doing something yourself, or it may allow you to do a much larger scale project that you would be able to do if you were doing it independently. But profitability is also a really important criteria that a lot of people will look at when they're considering these sorts of things. Speed of delivery, how quickly can we get this project made and to market and delivered to a broadcaster, for instance? So how quickly does this thing actually, from where to go, how long is it going to take to make? Again, as we were talking in the break, that's potentially really important right now in terms of how you prioritize your projects, because we do know that the capacity to be able to rapidly deliver projects when the market starts to open up again will probably be fairly important for people, because they're going to be desperate for content, and things which can be delivered fast will be important for them. Creative control. So to what extent do you have creative control over the project? Again, that's important for some people, not for others. Formatability. So, for some businesses who are really interested in developing formats as opposed to original, just one-off pieces of content, that may be important for them. Repeatability, probably more relevant for television producers. Is this project likely to go to series? Is it something which is going to have some longevity and capacity for people to want to buy multiple series and repeat orders for a particular project? So all of those sorts of things. So that's important. And then audience. So again, you may your brand may be aligned to creating particular types of content for particular audiences. You may be a kids producer, for instance. So is the project, does it align with the particular demographic that you tend to make shows for, and things like that. So there's lots of different ways of assessing project characteristics, and there'll probably be some other ones there which I haven't mentioned, which are appropriate for you. But mapping those out and coming up with those criteria in the first instance is really important when you're starting to consider the sorts of projects that you want to be working on. The second thing, once you've actually come up with that list of criteria, then is to determine what's mandatory. So, what are the absolute go, no-go type of things? So if there's any things which absolutely mean that you won't do a project, or that you absolutely have to have in a project, it's really important to be able to think that through and articulate that really clearly from the get-go, so that you don't, just so you're aware of it, and so you can also talk to people about that when they're bringing projects to you, or when you're going out there to try to find projects. Third thing then is to start to think about the relative merits or priority that you want to give to each of those criteria. So when you are thinking about weighting priorities, you want to give those characteristics that are more important to you a higher weighting than others. And the reason why this is important, and we'll come to this in the next couple of slides, is that it allows us then to start to map out projects visually. It doesn't allow us to map out projects visually. Just having those characteristics which we can actually give scores to is important, and be able to map out how a project fits visually compared to our assessment criteria. But by providing a weighting to each of those assessment criteria, it allows us to then come up with what we call a meta score. So actually giving a project some sort of score so that you can then compare it to other projects. So let's just talk about meta scores for a moment, and what we actually mean by that, because it's a little bit of an unusual idea, but it can be incredibly useful for some people. What I've just got up here on the screen is some of the maths of how that kind of works. But a metascore is effectively a weighted average model. It allows us to analyze a range of different variables with different weightings, and then come up with a way of comparing those disparate projects by creating a single score against it. So again, we will give you a model in the Dropbox, so you can sort of jump in and have a play around with this, and you can have a go yourself. But just so you can sort of understand roughly how this all works, what we have up here is the maths. So we've got down the left-hand side here a number of different categories. In this instance, we've got 7 different categories. And then we have applied for each of those a weighting. Now, the weighting that you give it can be completely arbitrary. It's entirely up to you as to how much you give in terms of a weighting to anything. The score that you give it can be out of 100, it can be out of 5, it can be out of 10, it can be out of whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. But it just gives you a way of saying that this particular characteristic is more important to me than that characteristic. And so by going through and setting that weighting for each of the category areas, what it allows us to then do is to establish a multiplier for then doing an adjusted score. So I'll come back to the multiplier in a second. The score is then something which you give to an individual project. So when you're assessing a number of projects, you then, for each project, give it a score against each of those categories. And then the multiplier gives us that adjusted score. So if we gave everything, in this instance, we've given a score out of 10. If everything got a 10, the meta score would be 100. But in this instance, as you can sort of see, that that the actual weighted value for different categories is different. If we look at category 1, even though it's only got an 8 out of 10, the adjusted score is actually much more important to contributing towards the bottom meta score than the third category, category 3, which has only got a weighting of 6. Even though given that 10 out of 10, it's only contributing 11.54 to the meta score. So what it means is that, yeah, we can then start to compare different projects, but on the basis of what's actually important to us in terms of the criteria. Now, in terms of the maths underneath it, again, we will give you the Excel spreadsheet so you can sort of see how that works. But the way in which the multiplier works is that we add up all of those weightings together. So I think in our instance, that adds up to 52. And if we divide the actual individual weighting category by the total number of weightings, that gives us the multiplier. And then we can multiply that by the proportion of what our score is out of. So in this instance, the score is out of 10. So 100 divided by 10 gives us 10. So the category multiplier in this instance, if we look at category 1, we're saying 10 divided by 52. So 10 is the weighting we're giving to it, divided by 52, which is the total of all the weightings. And then we're multiplying that by 100 over 10, which is 10. So that gives us 1.92. So again, when we have a look at the, when you look in the Dropbox, you'll see there's a file in there called weighting and metascore, and you can use that to actually, work out some categories and set your own sorts of criteria as to how you want to do it, and also set your own weightings. So what does that actually mean? Why do we use a metascore? Now here's just a worked example of a sample project that we've done and that we've given a whole bunch of weightings to, and that we've put through this sort of model. So firstly, what it allows us to do is to visualize where the relative merits of a particular project are. So in this instance, where we've picked a whole range of different things that we're measuring it against, and we might have a target criteria, or which is the red line in there, but the blue line is really what we're looking at. So we can sort of see in this project that compared to where we would like it to be, it doesn't necessarily do so well on our size and scale metrics, our formatability or our tenure, but it scores really well, and it's easy to finance. It brings some great intangible benefits, and we've got some good rights exploitation opportunities off the back of it. So again, what's going to be appropriate for your company, the criteria that you're going to use and the weighting you apply to each of those will be different. But what it's allowed us to do is to then come up with a meta score, which allows us to then say, out of 100, this is roughly how well this project aligns with our key categories that we've weighted, so we can understand how it then sits compared to another project. So if we're comparing an observational documentary to a drama, which are completely different in terms of their scope and scale, it then by understanding how those align with our own characteristics of what's important to us, allows us to then sort of come up with this sort of score, which gives us a clear understanding of whether or not it's something we should be pursuing or not. So if you've set your priorities and your weightings correctly, and you've aligned them to your own business's goals, then a weighted metascore can really help you to weigh the relative value of each project for your business. It also allows you to prioritize those competing concepts. So when you have a number of projects that are similar in nature, you can visually sort of see where the strengths and weaknesses are, and you can have a numeric way of understanding the relative strengths of those projects aligned with each other compared to the categories you've determined are right for you. And so where that's really useful is when you're starting to make decisions around how you're going to allocate resources. So very few companies have got unlimited resources at their disposal when it comes to development. Having a way of determining the best way of allocating those resources based on the projects that you're considering putting into development can be really useful, in particular when those resources are scarce. How can a number like this be right? Well, it can be right if you've asked the right questions and allocated the right sort of weightings to how important those things are for you. So in some ways, it's difficult to imagine that you can sort of have just a number which does compare quite different projects and tells you which ones you should be prioritizing. But if you've as I say, if you've asked the right questions and you've asked the questions which are relevant to what is important to you as a business, and you've allocated the right sorts of weightings in terms of how relatively important each of those characteristics are, then theoretically, then a meta score should be able to give you these sorts of a fairly accurate sort of picture of whether or not a project is right for you. Next point that I just want to talk about quickly before we finish up for today. We've only got this one last slide to get through, and then we can go back to some more questions and answers, is sales management. So sales is another thing which is absolutely critical for any business, and which is something which most people in the creative industries tend not to like doing. It is just a numbers game though. So while marketing is really good at helping you raise your profile, getting you known, getting your brand out there, sales is really about getting the right information in front of the right people at the right time and converting them to actually a paying client in some way. A big part of sales is the fact that people are going to say no to you, and that's fine. Everybody has a strike rate. Nobody sells 100% of the projects that they're going to come up with. Grundy's Television, which was arguably one of Australia's most prolific production companies, and seemed to own Australian television for a number of decades there, apparently had a 1 out of 20 success rate in its pitches, which seems incredibly low when you think about it. But admittedly, they were pitching an awful lot of shows, and an awful lot of them did get up. But it's important to understand that you're going to get more no's than yeses during your sales activities, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. Everybody does that. Having the tenacity and the capacity to actually understand that each no is actually just a step closer to a yes can be invaluable in helping you to continue to drive your sales and your development activities forward. And having a system that helps you to understand all of those opportunities that you're currently managing and the various relationships that you have to help you to build those can really be useful as well. So part of the process that we encourage people to undertake is to map out what a sales conversion pipeline looks like. So in creative businesses, the process of a sale can take some time. Oftentimes it has to pass through a number of different people for approval. So the green light process often is, can be lengthy, and there's a number of people who have to say yes to something before it comes out the other end as actually being fully greenlit. So mapping that process out, what that process is for you, what the sales stages are for you, is really, really important. It allows you to then start to measure how well you're doing at each one of those stages of the pipeline as the sale progresses from one stage to the next. Again, in the Dropbox folder, we have in there a sample Excel document, which is just called Sales Template, and it's a free template which was provided by a software company called Pipedrive, which creates a customer relationship management software, CRM. And the Excel document's a really good way for you to start getting to grips with understanding how your sales pipeline works. But there's some really great software products out there which you can look at managing this for you as well. But if you wanted just to get started with it, by all means start in Excel and start playing around with it in there. Some other people use things like Trello boards and things like that, other free tools like that to be able to manage where these things are at. So a good sales pipeline tool allows you to measure your success rate between each stage of your sales pipeline, so you can see where you're having these conversion issues as you move through a sales activity. And so then you can sort of figure out how you can get better at converting from one stage of your sales pipeline to the next. Another really important element of a good CRM, which is worth considering, is having a really good database behind it. So that's making sure that it's integrated into your CRM so that you can keep track of the contacts that you have who are relevant for your sales activities into a single repository of knowledge that you can continue to go back to when you're trying to figure out, as you're progressing a project. You can see where it's been, who you've pitched it to. For a new project, you can consider who you do want to pitch it to and whether they align with the sensibilities of that particular project. So integrating that database with your sales process means that things can't fall through the cracks. You won't forget to follow up a particular person about a particular opportunity. You won't try to pitch the same project to somebody twice. So that's where those sorts of CRM tools can really come into their own. It's worth having a look at lots of the different CRMs which are out there and doing a bit of research to find out the ones which are going to work for you. So get out there and have a play with those sorts of things. But as I said, there is on the Dropbox a sample document there for you to start playing around with, and that's got in there a mapped out sales pipeline which you can go and edit to make it suitable for you, and then some tools and metrics there to be able to just manually keep track of your sales activities as you're working through them. Okay, well, I think that was it for the main part of our session today in terms of slides that we wanted to go through. I might just bring Richard back up on the screen.
Sorry, someone just asked a specific question about Lumi, which is an interesting question, which I just thought I'd start on. I mean, look, I'm a fan partly because when I was in enterprise, we actually funded the early development of the project. So it's hard to look. It's a commercial application, obviously, but it seems to be getting quite a bit of movement. And we've been given a pretty brief play on it, but it's certainly worth exploring. It certainly seems to be very good at project management for very specific. What do you call it? Very specific, developing, managing projects, and it's come because the team that's come up with it with Karen has been based in production management. So it's early, but it seems to be getting a lot of interest so far. But I guess we'll see. I don't know if you've had a play with it, Ian, since we had our demonstration of it, or.
I've got my demo account. I must admit, I've been a bit shut out.
I haven't used as much as I promised I would during the lockdown either. But yeah, it
looked really impressive. The great thing about Lumi is that it's been built by people who understand the production process. It's built specifically to address the frustrations that they had when they were running their own projects. So, when you have something which is built by somebody for a very specific purpose to address the frustrations that they had, chances are it'll probably do that well for other people. But I haven't had enough of a chance to really get in and play around with it yet to really have a look at it.
Yeah, the basic idea of it was a great one, and it's sort of one of those remarkable ones where you go, our whole industry is so based on post-it notes, emails, very kind of unconnected series of information, and the idea is to bring all of those things together. So the basic premise seems pretty good. So I'm just trying to remember, and forgive me if you mentioned this earlier or didn't focus on it, but there's always one thing that you've always said to me. I've spoken to a number of producers about it, which is this idea of when you're doing business planning is making that one of those core decisions about, for example, am I a producer? Am I a production company? Am I in business, or am I creating a business, or am I just being entrepreneurial? And I think that is part of this business planning. It always strikes me as kind of a very fundamental question that is worth asking, because again, business planning can be used by people who decide not to create a business that wants to be sold or get investors, but it's also quite a core decision that people should be thinking about as they look at their business in terms of where they want to be in 5 years.
Yeah, and I think it's the difference between, people sometimes make the mistake that I've got a company, therefore I'm a business, and it's not actually the case. So a business, in many ways, the way in which I tend to think about businesses is that they're an asset. They're something which sits outside of you, because really they are an incorporated company, so they are separate from you, and that they have intrinsic value, so that they are something which in and of themselves have got value. They own assets or IP or things which make them valuable by themselves. And so therefore, in some way, you want to be able to continue to derive some sort of value from them. They need to be able to continue to, at the point that you no longer need them, you can either take that thing and sell it to somebody else, or you can in some way realize the value which sits within it. If you don't have that, then you probably don't have a business. You've just got a company, or it's probably just you doing a job via a company. And that's fine too. It's okay to be a freelancer, to just be creating a job for yourself, and using a company or a corporate structure to enable you to do that. But the way in which you then go about planning for that will be quite different, because if it's just about you, then really you're looking at doing some sort of career plan, some sort of personal goals. And now, not to say that you shouldn't be doing using the same sorts of tools to consider how you're going to plan your career, because it will be the thing which you're going to be using to generate revenue for yourself moving forward. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a business in and of itself. So much of what we're doing when we're talking about businesses is around trying to figure out ways of making businesses ready for investment or sale and things like that. And when we're thinking about those types of businesses, then we really need to be looking at how are the businesses in and of themselves separate from their owners and have that genuine value within themselves, which that's the the guy in Wollongong who had the ad agency. He could quite clearly demonstrate that the business had value in and of itself, because by slowly removing himself from it, the business didn't fall over. It continued to generate an income stream for him, and he could over time sell it to his staff members, and walk away and just play golf full time, which was really good, great outcome for him. But by forcing everybody to actually understand that it wasn't intrinsically him that was the business, that the business was the business, that was really important.
Yeah, I think one of the great challenges, obviously, and it happens a lot, obviously, in the screen production industries, where one person is often the rainmaker for that company, and they might be a producer or a director. They might be, but when they go and produce, it just means that the rest of the business kind of often has to stop. So that, I think it's a really key thing to be considering, because there's, like I said, there's nothing wrong with being a standalone editor, who sees themselves as a small business person, and can be very entrepreneurial and be very agile. But in the end, their business is them. And so it's just I've always thought that's a really kind of important thing for people as they their business plan. Is it about creating a job for myself, or is it actually about creating a company that is, like you said, has intrinsic value that you can either sell, get investors in, or literally stands alone when you want to go off, or you want to go off and do something else for a moment.
Yeah. Damien had a really interesting question there. What's the best tools that you're for doing a detailed roadmap and action plan for the business? Look, the one which we tend to use the most, just because it's free and we like free things, is Trello. And I don't know if you've played around with it. Trello's part of the Atlassian suite of products. But it's really just, the way I kind of describe it is kind of like a corkboard with post-it notes stuck on it, where you can sort of move them around and so on. But what it does allow you to do is to do those three things that we sort of were talking about. You can put on each of those little tags on the Trello board what the actionable item is. You can assign an individual to that one, so you can have multiple people sharing the same Trello board, and so you can assign a particular task to an individual or to multiple individuals, and you can put a time frame around it, so you can actually set this needs to be delivered by such and such a date. So and given those are almost always the three things that when we're creating action plans we really want to do. What is it? Who's responsible for it? When does it need to be delivered? I tend to find that's quite a useful tool to use.
There's a question about the time frames of the ongoing work and the plan being reviewed dynamically. I think for me, that seems to be an answer, both a yes and a no, which is yes, that business plans are absolutely dynamic. But I think if you're spending every morning coming in and changing your business plan based on the latest immediate thing, it may be a bit problematic. So I think when you're in production or when you're doing things, I don't know about you, Ian, I would say quarterly seems a pretty solidly well considered a level of dynamism. I wouldn't be expecting to go into it possibly even that often. But if things change, there's tactical changes you have to make on the ground, obviously. But really the business plan is the big thing that sits outside. Absolutely, it should be dynamic. I mean, if opportunities suddenly pop up, you don't suddenly go, well, I wasn't in my business. You can assess it. Hopefully you've looked at your business plan enough to kind of go, well, it meets all of these great criteria and it's not going to pull my business down. But absolutely, I think there are some tactical things in terms of just doing your production and getting things done. Keeping that balance.
This is where action plans and business plans kind of, action plans are kind of like a business plan in some way, but they're these sort of rolling 12-week activities. So, and they will have things you'll be doing today, tomorrow, next week, the week after, and so on. So you want to keep those updated at least on a monthly basis, probably even on a week-to-week basis. Use them as your work in progress type of Other elements of your business planning activities you might want to keep updated more frequently. So, for instance, Slack's also a great one. That's right, Sam. So that's good for collaborative chats and just sort of keeping dialogue open. And look, I know that a lot of this sort of stuff is actually incorporated into Lumi as well. So they've got things like that in there as well. So if you want to explore that tool as well, that would be worth having a look at. But there's going to be other elements of your plan which you probably do want to be looking at less frequently. So for your financials, for instance, I would advocate that you should be looking at those each month, but certainly no less than each quarter. But then when it comes to things like your environment scans and doing pests and SWOTs and things like that, there's probably not much point in doing them any more frequently than once a year. Now, when you look at a lot of shareholders agreements and investor agreements and things like that, they will always talk to the fact that at least once a year, the board needs to sign off on the business plan for the year ahead. So that seems to be, at least you probably wouldn't want to be doing, if you've got other external stakeholders in your business in particular, you probably by necessity have to be updating your business plan once a year. But when it comes to, that's a formal business plan. When it comes to just setting targets for yourself, and if you're not going through that formal business planning process, if you're doing top-line business planning and you're doing things which are more for yourself, then I think it needs to be this combination of week-to-week for action plans, probably monthly for reviewing financial stuff, and then quarterly for doing a slightly deeper dive into what's actually changed in the market, things like that.
Yeah. Can I just say, in terms of just applying for business plan support, I know there's been a number of different places. One of the challenges has actually, interestingly, been when an agency will say we need an application to get some money to do a business plan, but they actually sort of want it as a business plan before so it's a bit of a tricky balance there. I know that Screen Australia has just shifted their enterprise. They're actually reviewing their enterprise program and won't be doing that until next year, except for enterprise people. But a number of the state agencies do have business planning support, but it's worth, so that in terms of that, just, because we've been sort of struggling with that a little bit as well, but it's worth just noting that, you can do a business plan, which is kind of the top level stuff, which is just kind of thinking about who you are and all the rest of it. But then it basically just kind of keeps getting further and more detailed as you go through. And the more you go, the more numbers you can put behind it. But yes, I've been struggling with that one a little bit in the last little while, because numbers of people are saying, yes, Screen Queensland recently will say, yeah, it was kind of like put a business plan, but then to actually put some money for business planning. So if you're struggling with that, let us know.
Questions that's coming from, do we think that investors, so angels and incubators, will be investing there over the next, in startups for the next 12 months? Will they be avoiding new ventures? Good question. Look, the angel investors that I work with had a lot of pain for a very short period of time there. So, across their group, I suppose what they were seeing was that, because of course angel investors generally have fairly diversified portfolios where they've invested small amounts of money in a broad range of different products or business models. The diversification certainly probably helped them in that there was a number of businesses which they were relatively shielded from downturn in trade, just because they were in the agricultural sector or things like that, which weren't necessarily as impacted. But yeah, look, they're certainly a little bit more reluctant to be throwing money at things in the way that they were, at the end of last calendar year, where there was a real, air of appetite for risk in the sector. I suspect that they will still continue to be looking for opportunities for the next 12 months. They will probably just, the criteria they'll use to assess the types of projects they want to invest in, though, will probably be a little bit tighter and probably be a little bit more focused on shorter term exit events rather than long-term things. So they're not necessarily looking for things which got a 10, 15 year horizon for exit. They're probably looking to make their money back a little bit faster right now. And they may well be just, taking a slightly protectionist approach and sitting on their cash a little bit longer. But the nature of investors is that they do want to look to invest, and that oftentimes they're looking to snap up bargains at times where other people, may be a little bit more reluctant to spend. So it really depends on the nature of your business and what it is that you're looking to get from investors, and what it is you're offering in terms of potential ROIs and the timeframes around all of that. So I don't think I answered that question at all in any meaningful way, but it depends.
Yeah.
I suppose, is the answer.
Yeah, I don't think we know. I mean, I think it is. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is. Probably the same things, the same principles will apply. Where's a bargain? How's the world changing? Do we think this is actually going to make an impact on that? Same. But I think there's going to be certainly some capital looking around for the opportunities out of the economic destruction.
Yeah. So as I said, the ones who I'm talking to are actively looking for opportunities to invest, but they're being very careful to do their due diligence on those opportunities, and probably looking at things which have got a slightly lower risk profile to what they might have been looking at 6 months ago.
Can I just, if there's no questions, are there questions? So I've just added a couple. I think you may have answered them. We've got the best tools for the roadmap and action plan. Is that you answered that? And then they both gone through? Yeah. The only other thing, I was interested, you're talking about the pathways to yes stuff. We all get rejected, and we all, no one is ever getting a full hit rate. I think the other thing is the trickiest thing is obviously, and this is what I used to find at an enterprise or any application process is kind of self-awareness. So recognizing when a no comes back, why it's a no, whether this project is actually, they just didn't get it, or whether it actually genuinely is something worth pursuing. It's a tricky business, and there's no sort of clear science on knowing that, but it is being able to recognize how much an idea or a project or something is worth pushing based on rejection, and how much it really is a genuine business proposition. It's going to be the same thing for whether it's angel investors or others. So there is this balance between, it's a lot of the projects. So for example, a lot of the ideas that would come in for enterprise that I would look at, or even for marketing applications or whatever it is, you just, when someone's sort of making a proposal, but you can tell they don't have a sense of a self-awareness about where that really sits. I think that's, that's going to be sitting outside you. Whereas if you can actually just be really clear, but actually knowing the limits of what you're asking for or suggesting, or what the challenges are, it makes a big difference.
Very, very good comment there from Damien. Thank you. I won't read that one out loud, but
that's right.
Role of crowdfunding and that in this current market. It's a really good question. Crowdfunding, look, it's an interesting space. It hasn't worked tremendously well for screen businesses as a general rule. There's one or two exceptions to that. Where those exceptions have existed, oftentimes has been around pieces of IP where there was already a heavily engaged audience who was keen to see that piece of IP realised or imagined in a different format. So, for instance, a heavily engaged television audience who were keen to see a feature film version of a project being made, and then a crowdfunding model has worked well on that. I can't think of too many examples where it's worked particularly well outside of those types of instances. It does happen a little bit with short films and things like that, helping to get particular projects financed. Probably not so much on the larger things. I think, as a general rule, the appetite for general consumers right now to be investing in things outside of what they immediately need is probably fairly low. I haven't seen any of the stats on what crowdfunding sites have been doing recently, but I suspect that they've probably taken a little bit of a decline compared to what.
Fundamentally, the challenge with it is that the actual numbers are pretty marginal in terms of the numbers you need to actually get big screen production up. And so where there's sort of waxed and waned, and where there's been some opportunity in crowdfunding is probably in the development space, which is great. If someone can go and find a bit of, whereas 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 is not going to touch the sides of most big productions. It may touch the side when it comes to development. So there are some opportunities to do it if you think it's doing it. But the big challenge is it's not really substituting for lack of investment in other places. That's still remaining largely the same.
And it's unlikely for it to be large enough to really be a gap, finance.
Yeah, that's right. It hardly touches the sides. That's right. Yeah. But if you can raise $2 million doing it, good on you.
Oh yeah. Tell me how.
Yeah, tell me where you get them from. Yeah.
There are a range of platforms out there. It's worth exploring because there are some which are much more film focused and screen project focused. So it's I can't look. I was looking at this about 6 months ago. I must admit I've been focusing more on equity funding platforms recently, which are interesting as a model because Australia does allow them. So things like virtual, are ones which are out there. But it would be definitely worth doing a little bit of desktop research just to see which platforms are out there which really do genuinely focus in on the screen sector.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. I hope you found that useful. I will endeavour to make sure that you can get those Dropbox links to all of the different templates and other documents which we were mentioning throughout today's session, so you can have a look at those. And as you look at them, if there are any questions you have as to how to use them, or which you want just a quick chat around the utility, by all means reach out to one of the 113 team. We all sort of have a level of familiarity with them, so any of us will be very happy to answer your questions and see how we can help. So thank you all.
Well.
And yes, stay safe and stay well.
Good luck. Yeah, that's right. Stay safe.